I think when we bring it back to the UK government repaying the slave owners for having the slaves at the time, I think we need to bring it back and put it into context, right? I'm assuming back in the day, all the slave owners were very, very against giving up their slaves, obviously. But at the same time, the UK government wanted to go ahead with this law. But at the time, all parliamentarians, and still now, are directly linked with with businesses and corporations. So I guess I don't want to give a justification for why the UK government had to give them a loan, but I think it is. It's important to acknowledge that there is that nuance with it. It's not just the UK government was evil and did that.
No, of course not. No. And I think also as well we have to acknowledge that the reason Britain ended the slave trade wasn't just because we suddenly thought after 400 years, this is actually really bad. We shouldn't be doing it. There were some people.
There was a bit of that, yes.
There was a bit of that, but it was in the economic the economic argument had been made that actually free trade, having people paid a wage. I mean, if you look at the condition of working class people in this country in the 1830s, it was horrendous. Okay, they worked but the model was they were thinking to themselves, we can make super profits now that we've invested in machinery and industry and so on. We don't need the slaves anymore. Actually, we want to pivot to being a free trading society, an economy, and actually we can pay people a pittance and still make lots of profit. And that's part of the reason why economically and politically Britain decided to end the slave trade. But it didn't just end it for itself. It also, as we know, tried to ensure that no other countries could use slavery to kind of prop themselves up like we had. We were on the major beneficiaries of enslavement and slavery, and we used
in the most recent history. Because
in the most recent history,
slavery has existed throughout history, back to the Roman Empire and all that.
Of course it has. Now, I get this all the time. Oh, are you going to be calling for compensation for the fact that my ancestor was enslaved by the Romans? And I'm like, well, if you can show me, as you can with the UCL archives, a direct link between the person that benefited from enslaving your ancestor all the way to today, to millionaires or corporations, then I'm happy to talk about that. But you can't. The reality is, I'll give you an example. Aviva, here in Norwich, right? Aviva, it's a good, solid Norwich company. Well, here's a story. That one of the families that received the most money from the British state in compensation for freeing their slaves after the 7-year period, the eldest son went on and set up an insurance company. And at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, that insurance company had merged with another. It merged with something I think called Imperial Insurance or Star Insurance, but they basically merged together and they formed Norwich Union. And Norwich Union went on to become Aviva. So the genesis of Aviva, the biggest employer in Norwich,
One of the
foundation stones of Aviva was the compensation from slavery. So I think, when you understand that, you can then see a direct link between slavery, the suffering of slavery, the poverty that's in the Caribbean, and the fact that you have a multi-billion-pound corporation that I meet regularly, and go to see because they employ my constituents. Do I want them to kind of collapse and be impoverished? No. But do I want that acknowledgement? Yes. And do I want to see Aviva play its role in reparatory justice? I'd love to see that. The Bank of England is doing that. Lloyd's, they've all basically looked at how they made their money. They want to contain it, but I think there's a bigger issue here about how we as the state, we know the king, the monarchy, for example, the king has said, the slave trade should be looked at in the same way that we teach the Holocaust. It was a crime against humanity. It was something that it wasn't something that others did to others. So the Germans did to the Jewish people or whoever, we did it. And it's a little bit more difficult to come to terms with. And I don't think we can hide behind the fact that it was hundreds of years ago, because we can still see who the beneficiaries are of it. It's directly. Whereas if you go back to Roman or Viking times or so on, it's a bit more convoluted.
It is, but the principle's the same, isn't it?
So no, I don't think it is, because I think, look, I can't deny throughout human history there's probably been slavery. And no one's suggesting for a second that there's compensation for everyone who can. But if you can still see that racism is a direct impact, structural racism is a direct impact of slavery. Okay, many of the big corporations and the people who have vast wealth in this country, many of the stately homes, or many of the people who you can directly link that money back to slavery. So that is having an impact. It has an impact today on who has wealth and who has power. So in that sense, I think it's different than, say, for someone who 2,000 years ago held slaves. Well, I can't tell you how that Roman 2,000 years ago who held slaves, how their descendants, do they benefit from that? It's a bit more difficult to work out.
I see, and I think that's a perfect point in terms of a lot of the arguments that people put against reparation is that, okay, the people living now were not directly affected, like directly had, and they weren't slaves themselves.
No, that's right.
So what's the justification for putting?
But if you go to the Caribbean and look at the poverty of those countries, so these countries generated vast wealth for us, and when we left the Caribbean in the 1950s and 60s, we left massive levels of illiteracy. There was no infrastructure.
Misery.
Vast poverty. And those countries now, when people think about the Caribbean, they think about palm trees, white beaches, and lovely seas. Go inland, go behind the scenes, and you will see shanty towns. You will see poor education systems, poor sanitation, and no healthcare system, no welfare state to speak of. If you get ill, you're ill. So that's the reality of living in the Caribbean. And the people who serve you in the hotels or come to you, those are people who then go back, many of them, and live in poverty. So it's about doing what's right and making sure that those who have benefited from it perhaps help pay back something to those. And what are the benefits for us? We live in a kind of fragmenting global economy, okay, where globalization is beginning to fragment. We know that, I talk to Tories about this, we know that the Chinese, for example, and the Russians and others are trying to pull away the Caribbean into their sphere of economic interest. So even from a purely practical, self-interested point of view, if we help build up the islands in the Caribbean, who are they going to want to trade with once their economies pick up? Who are they going to want to work with and cooperate with? Us. So, even if it's from a self-interested point of view, then we need to think about that.